Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the History Desk. Thank you for joining me for this new episode. In our last episode, we discussed the Saratoga campaign and how the defeat of the British army under Burgoyne, coming from the north, showed the world the colonists of America could stand toe-to-toe with the British. In this episode, we will be discussing the Philadelphia campaign, which was going on relatively the same time as parts of the Saratoga campaign, and it would be the reason Gen Howe was unable or unwilling to aid Burgoyne when he needed it. With Philadelphia being the capital of the proposed American nation, Howe believed its capture would end the war. War at this time period would usually end when the capital of one of the participants was captured, but in the case of the Americans and their almost guerrilla-style tactics of their militia, they could operate from anywhere, and though important their capital was, anywhere the Congress convened and was safe. Because of this, Howe, thinking in the traditional sense of warfare of the time, led him to put a much more importance in capturing the capital than it would be to the Continental losing it. Yes, it would be a moral defeat to lose the city, but it would not end the war for the colonies, as they were determined to win their freedom, and the loss of one city, even as an important city such as Philadelphia, would not stop that. Before we get started with Howe's actions, I would like to take the time to ask all of you if you enjoy the content, if you have been receiving here, please share the show with your friends and family or any you believe that might like it. It will help the show out greatly and allow me to continue producing the historical content I love and is a way for you to support the show. Alright, are you ready? Here we go. Howe decided by early April against taking his army overland to Philadelphia through New Jersey, as this would entail a difficult crossing of the broad Delaware River under hostile conditions, and it would likely require the transportation or construction of the necessary watercraft. Howe's plan, sent to Germain on April 2nd, also effectively isolated Burgoyne from any possibility of significant support, since Howe would be taking his army by sea to Philadelphia, and the New York garrison would be too small for any significant offensive operations up the Hudson River to assist Burgoyne. Washington realized that Howe was in a good position to help Burgoyne, and was baffled when he didn't do so. Washington at the time, and historians even since, have wondered why Burgoyne was not helped by Howe and why he wasn't in place. Historians agree that Lord Germain did a poor job in coordinating the two campaigns. This is maybe he was pitting the two generals against each other. Following Howe's capture of New York and Washington's retreat across the Delaware, Howe, on December 20th, 1776, wrote to Germain, proposing an elaborate set of campaigns for 1777. These included operations to gain control of the Hudson River, expand operations from the base of Newport, Rhode Island, and take Philadelphia, the seat of the Liberal Continental Congress. The latter Howe saw as attractive, since Washington was then just north of the city. Howe wrote that he was persuaded the principal army should act defensively against Philadelphia, where the enemy's chief strength lies. Germain acknowledged that this plan was particularly well digested, but it called for more men than Germain was prepared to provide. After the setbacks in New Jersey, Howe, in mid-January 1777, proposed operations against Philadelphia that included an overland expedition and a sea-based attack, thinking these might lead to a decisive victory over the Continental Army. This plan was developed to the extent of, in April, Howe's army was seen constructing pontoon bridges. Washington, lodged still at his winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey, thought they would eventually be used on the Delaware River. However, by mid-May, Howe had apparently abandoned the idea of an overland expedition, and he was quoted, "To invade Pennsylvania by sea, we must probably abandon the New Jerseys." Howe's decision to not assist Burgoyne may have been rooted in his perception that Burgoyne would receive credit for a successful campaign, even if it required Howe's help, and pitting those generals against each other. This would not help Howe's reputation, as the Philadelphia expedition would if it succeeded. There was a lot of jealousy between the commanders of the British Army, vying for the king's favor, the Parliament's favor, and higher positioning. Howe himself wrote to Burgoyne on July 17th, "My intention is for Pennsylvania, where I expect to meet Washington, but if he goes to the northward contrary to my expectations, and you can meet him at bay, be assured I will soon be after him to relieve you." He sailed from New York not long after. Washington's Continental Army had been encamped primarily at Morristown, New Jersey, although there was a forward base at Bound Brook only a few miles from the nearest British outposts. In part as a retaliatory measure against the ongoing skirmishes, General Charles Cornwallis executed a raid against that position in April 1777, in which he was very nearly captured the outpost commander, Benjamin Lincoln. In response to this raid, Washington moved his army forward to a strongly fortified position at Middlebrook in the Watchung Mountains that commanded likely British land routes towards Philadelphia. For reasons that are not entirely clear, General Howe moved a sizable army to Somerset Courthouse, south of New Brunswick. If he performed this move as a feint to draw Washington out from his strong position, it failed, as Washington refused to move his army out in force. Washington had intelligence that Howe had not brought the necessary equipment for either bringing or constructing watercraft, so this move seemed unlikely to him to be a move towards the Delaware River. When Howe eventually withdrew his army back toward Perth Amboy, Washington did follow, launching a lightning strike. Howe sent forces under Cornwallis in an attempt to cut Washington off from the high ground. This attempt was foiled in the Battle of Short Hills. Howe then withdrew his troops to Perth Amboy, embarking them on transports and sailing out of New York Harbor, destined for Philadelphia. Washington did not know where Howe was going. Considering the possibility that Howe was again feinting and could actually sail his army up the Hudson to join Burgoyne, he remained near New York. Only when he received word that Howe's fleet had reached the mouth of the Delaware did he need to consider the defense of Philadelphia. However, the fleet did not enter the Delaware, instead continuing south. Uncertain of Howe's goal, which could be Charleston, South Carolina, he considered moving north to assist in the defense of the Hudson, when he learned that the fleet had entered Chesapeake Bay. In August, he began moving his troops south to prepare the city's defense. General John Sullivan, who commanded the Continental Army's troops facing Staten Island, had, in order to capitalize on perceived weakness of the British position there following Howe's departure, attempted a raid on August 22nd that failed, which would be called the Battle of Staten Island. In the late August 1777, after a distressing 34-day journey from Sandy Hook on the coast of New Jersey, a Royal Navy fleet of more than 260 ships, carrying some 17,000 British soldiers under the command of British General Sir William Howe, landed at the head of Elk River on the northern end of the Chesapeake, near the present-day Elkton, Maryland, then known as Head of Elk, approximately 40 to 50 miles southwest of Philadelphia. Unloading the ships proved to be a logistical problem because the narrow river neck was shallow and muddy. General George Washington had placed the American forces between Head of Elk and Philadelphia. His forces were able to reconnoiter the British landing from Iron Hill, near Newark, Delaware, about 9 miles to the northeast. Because of the delay disembarking the ships, Howe did not set up a typical camp, but quickly moved forward with the troops. As a result, Washington was not able to accurately gauge the strength of the opposing forces. After a skirmish at Cook's Bridge south of Newark, the British troops moved north, and Washington abandoned a defensive encampment along the Red Clay Creek near Newport, Delaware, to deploy against the British at Chadds Ford. This site was important, as it was the most direct passage across the Brandywine River on the road from Baltimore to Philadelphia. On September 9th, Washington positioned detachments to guard other fords above and below Chadds Ford, hoping to force the battle there. Washington employed General John Armstrong, commanding about 1,000 Pennsylvania militia, to cover Powell's Ford, 5.8 miles south of Chadds Ford, which was covered by Major General Henry Wayne's and Nathaniel Greene's division. Major General John Sullivan's division extended northward along the Brandywine's east banks, covering the high ground north of Chadds Ford, along with Major General Adam Stephen's division and Major General Lord Sterling's division. Further upstream was a brigade under Colonel Moses Hazen covering Buffington's Ford and Widster's Ford. Washington was confident that the area was secure. The British grouped forces at nearby Kennett Square. Howe, who had better information about the area than Washington, had no intention of mounting a full-scale frontal attack against the prepared American defense. He instead employed a flanking maneuver similar to that used in the Battle of Long Island. About 6,800 men, under the command of Wilhelm von Keppenhausen, advanced to meet Washington's troops at Chadds Ford. The remainder of Howe's troops, about 9,000 men under the command of Lord Cornwallis, marched north to Trimble's Ford across the west branch of the Brandywine Creek, then east to Jeffrey's Ford across the east branch, 2 fords that Washington had overlooked as a result of poor understanding of the area and lack of credible reconnaissance, and then south to flank the Americans. September 11th began with a heavy fog, which provided cover for the British troops. Washington received contradictory reports about the British troop movements and continued to believe that the main force was moving to attack at Chad's Ford in his front. At 5:30 a.m., the British and Hessian troops began marching east along the Great Road, now Route 1, from Kennett Square, advancing on the American troops positioned where the roads crossed Brandywine Creek. The first shots of the battle took place at about 4 miles west of Chad's Ford, at Welch's Tavern. Elements of Maxwell's Continental Light Infantry skirmished with the British vanguard, primarily the Queen's Rangers, a battalion of Royalists. The British continued to advance and encountered a great force of Continentals behind the stone walls on the old Kennett Meeting House grounds. The battle was fought at mid-morning around the meeting house while the pacifist Quakers continued to hold their midweek service. One of the Quakers would later write, "While there was much noise and confusion without, all was quiet and peaceful within." From the meeting house grounds, the battle continued for 3 miles to the Brandywine Creek, at Chad's Ford. Eventually, the British pushed the American back, but not before suffering heavy losses. The main British column under General Cornwallis, and accompanied by Gen Howe, set out from Kennett Square at 5 a.m. Local Loyalist sources had provided Howe with knowledge of 2 unguarded fords above the forks of the Brandywine. The 17-mile flank march took approximately 9 hours to complete. The British appeared on the American right flank at around 2 p.m. and took a much-needed rest on Osborne's Hill, a commanding position north of the Continental Army. Having received intelligence from Colonel Bland's scouts, Washington ordered Sullivan to take overall command of Sterling and Stephen's division, in addition to his own, and quickly march north to meet the British flank attack. As they were forming their lines north of Dilworth, Howe launched his attack, having taken overall command of the right wing of the army. Sullivan left his division to confer with the other generals. His own division he left under the command of Prudhomme de Boer, with orders to shift to the right in order to link up with Sterling and Stephen's division. From the left to right, the divisions were arranged as Sullivan, Sterling, and Stephen. As the British lines advanced, the Hessian Jaegers threatened to flank the Americans' right, forcing Stephen and Sterling to shift right. Howe was slow to attack, which brought time for the Americans to position some of their men on high ground near Birmingham Meeting House, about a mile north of Chad's Ford. By 4 p.m., the British attacked. The British brigade of guards caught de Boer by surprise on the American left, before de Boer had time to fully form, and immediately sent them into disarray, causing the entire division to rout. Initially, Stephen and Sterling's division held firm, aided by a battery of artillery on a knoll between their divisions. However, the British light infantry battalions, aided by the Jaegers, eventually caused Stephen's division to fall back. A bayonet charge by the British Grenadier battalions in the center similarly forced Sterling to retreat. The Marquis de Lafayette had only just arrived, joining Sterling's divisions when he received a wound while trying to rally and retreat the retreating troops. Around 6 p.m., Washington arrived with reinforcements to try to hold off the British, who now occupied the Meeting House Hill. Washington conferred with Greene and Knox, the latter of whom was head of the artillery, in the yard of the William Brinton House. The 2nd Battalion of Grenadiers was nearing their position and was joined by a fresh reserve brigade, the 4th British Brigade. It was determined that Knox would deploy artillery to slow the British advance. Greene's reinforcements, combined with the remnants of Sullivan, Stephen's, and Sterling's division, formed south of Dilworth and stopped the pursuing British for nearly an hour, letting the rest of the army retreat. When darkness fell, Greene's division finally began the march to Chester along with the rest of the army. The British army was not able to pursue due to the onset of night. The Americans were also forced to leave behind many of their cannons on Meeting House Hill, because almost all of their artillery horses were killed. Upon hearing of the attack of Cornwallis's column, Keppenhausen launched an attack against the weakened American center across Chad's Ford, breaking through the divisions commanded by Wayne and William Maxwell and forcing them to retreat and leave behind most of their cannons. Armstrong's militia, never engaged in the fighting, also decided to retreat from their position. Further north, Greene sent Brigadier General George Whedon's troops to cover the road just outside the town of Dilworth to hold off the British long enough for the rest of the Continental Army to retreat. Darkness brought the British pursuit to a standstill, which then allowed Whedon's force to retreat. The defeated Americans retreated to Chester, where most of them arrived at midnight, with stragglers arriving morning. The American retreat was well organized, largely because of the efforts of Lafayette, who, although wounded, created a rally point that allowed for more orderly retreat before being treated for his wound. The official British casualty list detailed 587 casualties, 93 killed, 8 officers, 7 sergeants, and 78 rank and file. 488 wounded, 395 of those rank and file, and 6 rank and file missing unaccounted for. Only 40 of the British Army casualties were Hessians. No casualty returns for the American Army of Brandywine survives, and no figures, official or otherwise, were ever released. The nearest thing to a hard figure for the American side was by Major General Nathaniel Greene, who estimated that Washington's army had lost between 1,200 and 13 men. On September 14th, about 350 wounded Americans were taken from the British camp at Dilworth to a newly established hospital at Wilmington, Delaware. This would suggest that of the near 400 prisoners reported by Howe, only about 50 had surrendered unwounded. If General Greene's estimate of the total American loss was accurate, then they had between 1,160 and 1,260 killed, wounded, or deserted during the battle. The British also captured 11 out of the 14 of American artillery pieces. Among the American wounded was the Marquis de Lafayette. In addition to losses in the battle, 315 men were posted as deserters from Washington's camp during this stage of the campaign. Although Howe had defeated the American army, his lack of cavalry prevented its total destruction. Washington had committed a serious error in leaving his right flank wide open and could have brought about his army's annihilation had it not been for Sullivan, Sterling, and Stephen's divisions, which bought them time. Evening was approaching, and in spite of the early start Cornwallis had made in the flanking maneuver, most of the American army was able to escape. In this report of Continental Congress detailing the battle, Washington stated, "Despite the day's misfortune, I am pleased to announce that most of my men are in good spirits and still have the courage to fight the enemy another day." After Washington's defeat at the Battle of Brandywine, he was intent on accomplishing 2 tasks. He wanted to protect Philadelphia from British forces under the command of Howe, and he needed to replenish the rapidly dwindling supplies and munitions which were stored at Vanley Furnace in Reading, Pennsylvania. Washington withdrew across the Schuylkill River, marched through Philadelphia, and headed northwest. Since the river was fordable only far upstream, starting at Matson's Ford, present-day Koshkongaken, Washington could protect both the capital and the vital supply areas to the west from behind the river barrier. Yet he reconsidered and recrossed the river to face the British, who had moved little since Brandywine, owing to the shortage of wagons to carry both their wounded and their baggage. General Howe was alerted of Washington had recrossed the river on the afternoon of September 15th, and by midnight his troops were on the march toward the major road junction where the White Horse Tavern stood. The going was difficult because the weather had been rainy and windy, and the troops and wagons turned the roads into muddy quagmires. The next morning, Washington's 10,000-man army was moving west through the Great Valley, bound by the North and South Valley Hills on either side. He learned from his cavalry, led by General Pulaski, that the British were advancing on him from the south, just a few miles away. Although moving to the North Valley Hills would have given Washington more time to deploy and possibly fortify, he ordered the army south directly towards the enemy to take up a defensive position on the southern Valley Hills. Washington sent an advance force under General Anthony Wayne to slow the British progress. At about 2 p.m., his men encountered the advanced Jaeger units of the Hessian column on one road. These forces began skirmishing, and Americans very nearly captured Colonel Karl Van Donop when he became separated from his main column with a small company of Jaegers. The main British column, led by General Cornwallis, met with Wayne's Pennsylvania militia on another road at around 3, who gave way in a panic retreat, suffering 10 killed or wounded. While this went on, Washington, who was trying to organize the line of battle, had a change of heart about the position and ended up withdrawing the army north of the tavern. This withdrawal was just getting underway when it began pouring rain. Hessian Jaeger Captain John Edward described it as an extraordinary thunderstorm, combined with the heaviest downpour in his world. The British army halted its advance, although General Wilhelm von Keppenhausen ordered the Jaegers to engage the enemy. Ewald and his men rushed forward, swords drawn since their muskets were inoperable because of the wet powder, and captured 34 men. Ewald reported losing 5 killed, 7 wounded, and 3 captured in this action. The storm, which historian Thomas Maguire describes as a classic nor'easter, raged well into the next day. The British were forced to construct a makeshift camp, having left their tents behind that day. And Washington managed to form a battle line, but a great deal of his ammunition had been spoiled by the rain and poorly constructed cartridge boxes. Washington once again withdrew beyond the river on September 19th to cover both the capital and his supply area, but he left behind General Wayne's Pennsylvania Division of 1,500 men and 4 guns with orders to harass the British rear. Washington temporarily based his headquarters at the Reading Furnace. Howe's army found it nearly impossible to follow Washington over the rutted, muddy roads. The decision was made to wait out the storm, then move towards the director. After the Battle of the Clouds, Washington withdrew to Yellow Springs and Reading Furnace in northern Chester County to replenish his ammunition. He left Brigadier General Mad Anthony Wayne's Pennsylvania Division at Yellow Springs. When the British columns moved towards the river, Wayne followed under orders from Washington to harass the British and attempt to capture all or part of the baggage train. Wayne assumed that his presence was undetected and camped close to the British lines 2 miles north of Paoli Tavern. His division consisted of the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 8th, 10th, and 11th Pennsylvania regiments, Hartley's additional Continental Regiment, an attached artillery company, and a small force of dragoons. All told, it was about 1,500 strong. Several miles to the west, and moving to join Wayne, was William Smallwood's Maryland militia of about 2,100 relatively inexperienced troops. The British heard rumors that Wayne was in the area, and General Howe sent out scouts who reported his location to be somewhere near Paoli Tavern and Warren Tavern, now Malvern, Pennsylvania, on September 19th. Since his position was just 4 miles from the British camp, Howe immediately planned an attack on Wayne's camp. At 10 p.m. on September 20th, British Commander Major General Charles Gray marched his force from the British camp and launched a surprise attack on Wayne's camp above the Warren Tavern, not far from the General Paoli Tavern. Gray's troops consisted of the 2nd Light Infantry, a composite battalion formed from the light companies of 13 regiments, plus the 42nd Foot Highland Regiment and 44th Regiment of Foot. A dozen troops of the 16th Queen's Light Dragoons were in the vanguard of the main British column. Altogether, this force numbered about 1,200 men. To ensure that the Americans were not alerted, General Gray ordered the troops should advance in silence with muskets unloaded and attack with the bayonet alone. In the case that loads could not be drawn from weapons, he ordered that the flints should be removed instead, earning the general the epithet No Flint Gray. In fact, Major Maitland, commanding officer 2nd Light Infantry Battalion, was given permission to advance with muskets loaded, given his personal assurance that his men could be relied on not to fire. Earlier, Wayne had received 2 warnings of possible attack and sent out sentries, who spotted the British forces 2 miles from camp and gave the alarm. Reaching the Warren Tavern, the British forced a local blacksmith to guide them and approached the camp silently along heavily wooded roads, where they hit a picket post. Most of the sentries fired into the dark, exposing their position, and were annihilated by the silent British vanguard. In the camp up the hill from the pickets, Wayne's troops were already formed up and armed. Hearing the firing from the pickets on the right, the main body of Wayne's force began moving west out of camp in a column through well-fenced fields, when a disabled cannon blocked the avenue of escape for several minutes. Now, with loud battle cries, the British stormed into the camp in 3 waves, the 2nd Light Infantry in the lead, followed by the 44th and the 42nd, with light dragoons sweeping across the camp. Some of Wayne's troops fired in the direction of the British attack, exposing their positions in the dark. The rear of Wayne's column was silhouetted by their campfires. Some fired into each other, and ensuing chaos caused troops in that part of the line to panic and run. Wayne organized a rear-guard defense, but many of his troops fled from the camp and were pursued for a mile or 2. Near the White Horse Tavern, the British encountered Smallwood's force and routed it as well. With casualties of only 4 killed and 7 wounded, the British had routed an entire American division. Americans lost 53 were buried on the battlefield, but whether they were all American dead or only those found on the campsite battlefield is uncertain. Local tradition says that 8 more Americans killed in the battle were buried at the nearby Anglican Church of St. Peter in the Great Valley. 71 prisoners were taken by the British, 40 of whom were so badly wounded they had to be left behind in nearby houses. A total of 272 men were killed, wounded or missing from Wayne's division after the battle. McGuire's reports the day after the battle, 52 dead Americans were buried, and another who was found dead later. 39 of the buried were unnamed. The highest ranking among them officers killed was Major Marine Lamar. The Continental Congress abandoned Philadelphia, moving first to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for 1 day and then to York, Pennsylvania. Repairs were made to the Van Leer furnace, and military supplies were also moved to Reading, Pennsylvania. On 26 September 1777, British forces marched into Philadelphia unopposed. Howe left a garrison of 3,462 men to defend the city, moving the bulk of his force north, some 9,728 men, to an outlying community of Germantown. With the campaigning season drawing to a close, Howe determined to locate and destroy the main American army. Howe established his headquarters at the Stenton Mansion, the former country home of James Logan. Despite having suffered successive defeats, Washington saw an opportunity to entrap and decisively defeat the divided British army. He resolved to attack the Germantown garrison as the last effort of the year before entering winter quarters. His plan called for a complex, ambitious assault. 4 columns of troops were to assail the British garrison from different directions at night with the goal of creating a double envelopment, or two surrounding. Washington's hope was that the British would be surprised and overwhelmed, much how the Hessians were at Trenton. Germantown was a hamlet of stone houses spreading from what is now known as Mount Airy on the north to what is now Market Square in the south. Extending southwest from Market Square was Schoolhouse Lane, running 1.5 miles to the point where Wishkatun Creek emptied from a steep gorge into the river. Howe had established his main camp along the high ground of Schoolhouse and Church Lanes. The western wing of the camp, under the command of Hessian General Wilhelm von Kappenhausen, had a picket of 2 Jaeger battalions positioned on the high ground above the mouth of the Wishkatun to the far left. A brigade of Hessians and 2 brigades of British regulars camped along Market Square. East of the square, 2 British brigades under the command of General James Grant had encamped with 2 light squadrons of dragoons and the 1st Battalion of Light Infantry. The Queen's Rangers, a unit of Loyalist Americans recruited from New York, covered the right flank, commanded by John Graves Simcoe. After dusk, on October 3rd, the American forces began a 16-mile march southward toward Germantown in complete darkness. To differentiate friends from foe in the darkness, the troops were instructed to put a piece of white paper in their hats to mark them out. The Americans remained undetected by the Jaeger pickets, and the main British camp was, subsequently, unaware of the American advance. For the Americans, it seemed their attempt to repeat their victory at Trenton was on the road to success. However, the darkness made communications between the American columns extremely difficult, and progress was far slower than expected. At dawn, most of the American forces had fallen too short of their intended positions, losing the element of supplies they otherwise enjoyed. The Pennsylvania militia, led by Brigadier General John Armstrong Sr., advanced down the Montani Road, Ridge Avenue, to the confluence of the Wishkatun Creek and the river. There, on the cliff opposite General Keppenhausen's Hessian encampment, the militia set up their artillery and began to fire until withdrawing back up Montani Road. Armstrong's brigade played no further part in the battle. The 3 remaining American columns continued their advance. One column, under the command of General John Sullivan, moved down Germantown Road. A column of New Jersey militia under Brigadier General William Smallwood moved down Skippack Road to White Mash Church Road, and from there to Old York Road to attack the British right. General Nathaniel Greene's column, consisting of Greene's General Adam Stephen's division and General Alexander McDougall's brigade, moved down Lamachlin Road. A thick fog clouded the battle throughout the day, greatly hampering coordination. The vanguard of Sullivan's column upon Germantown Road opened fire upon the British pickets on Mount Airy just after sunrise at 5 a.m. The British pickets fired their cannon in alarm and resisted the American advance. Howe rode forward, thinking they were being attacked by foraging or skirmishing parties, and ordered his men to hold their ground. It took a substantial part of Sullivan's division to finally overwhelm the British pickets and drive them back into Germantown. Howe, still believing his men were facing only light opposition, called out to shame his men that they had retreated for such a small party. Just then, 3 Americans' guns came into action, opening fire with grape shot. Howe and his staff quickly withdrew out of range. Several British officers were shocked to see their own soldiers rapidly falling back before the enemy attacked. One British officer later described the number of attacking Americans as overwhelming. Cut off from the main force, Colonel Musgrave of the British 40th Regiment of Foot ordered his 6 companies of troops, around 120 men, to barricade and fortify the stone house of Pennsylvania Chief Justice Benjamin Chew, called Cliveden. The American troops launched a determined assault against Cliveden. However, the outnumbered defenders repulsed their attempts, inflicting heavy casualties. Washington called a council of war to decide how to deal with the fortification. Some of his subordinates favored bypassing it entirely, leaving a regiment behind to besiege it. However, Washington's artillery commander, General Henry Knox, advised it was unwise to allow a fortified garrison to remain under enemy control in the rear of a forward advance, and Washington concurred. General William Maxwell's brigade, which had been held in reserve, was brought forward to storm Cliveden, partially led by a volunteer aide from General Washington's own staff, Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence, who had been shot through his right and therefore dominant shoulder early in the battle. He had continued the fight with his aide ribbon wrapped around his arm and his sword in his left and non-dominant hand. Knox positioned 4 3-pound cannon out of musket range to bombard the mansion. However, the thick walls of Cliveden withstood the bombardment from the light field guns. The Americans launched a second wave of infantry assaults, all of which were repulsed with heavy losses. The few Americans who managed to get inside the mansion were shot or bayoneted. It was becoming clear to the Americans that Cliveden was not going to be taken easily. Among this assault was Lieutenant John Marshall of the Virginia line, the future Chief Justice of the United States, who was wounded during the attack. Before completely disregarding the notion of taking Cliveden, Lawrence was offered the idea of burning or smoking the British out of the house. He took the idea. According to Gregory Mashery's biography, he sent men to gather firewood to pile at the door. Once enough was gathered, Lawrence and Marshall began to command the attack of the charging to the front steps, dropping the firewood in groups and rushing to set fire to the wood. Lawrence himself was sent forward with a torch with his companion, Major John White. The fire did not catch. While on the front steps of Cliveden, however, Lawrence was under a barrage of gunfire and supposedly wounded a second time by a bayonet in his left side. Major White was shot and later pronounced dead. Both men were forced from the door, and the Cavalier de Motet convinced Lawrence to cease his fighting before he was later moved to have a surgeon see to his wounds. Prior to Maxwell's futile attack against the Cliveden, Sullivan's division advanced beyond in the fog. Sullivan deployed Brigadier General Thomas Conway's brigade to the right and Brigadier General Anthony Wayne's brigade to the left before advancing on the British center left. The 1st and 2nd Maryland brigades of Sullivan's column paused frequently to fire volleys into the fog. While the tactic was effective in suppressing enemy, his troops rapidly ran low on ammunition. Wayne's brigade to the left of the road moved ahead and became precariously separated from Sullivan's main line. As the Americans launched their attack on Cliveden, Wayne's brigade heard the disquieting racket from Knox's artillery pieces to their rear. To their right, the firing from Sullivan's men died down as the Marylanders ran low on ammunition. Wayne's men began to panic in their apparent isolation, and so he ordered them to fall back. Sullivan was subsequently forced back, although the regiments fought a stubborn rearguard action. Since the British units pursuing them were redirected to fight Greene's column, Sullivan's men fell back in good order. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Greene's column on Lamberton Road had finally caught up with the bulk of the Americans at Germantown. Greene's vanguard engaged the British pickets at Lucan's Mill, driving them back after a savage skirmish. The fog that clung to the field was compounded by palls of smoke from the cannon and musket fire, throwing Greene's column into disarray and confusion. One of Greene's brigades, under Brigadier General Adam Stephen, veered off course and began following Meeting House Road instead of rendezvousing at Market Square with the rest of Greene's troops. The wayward brigade collided with Wayne's brigade and mistook them for redcoats. The 2 American brigades opened fire on each other in the fog, causing both to flee. The withdrawal of Wayne's New Jersey brigade, having suffered heavy losses attacking Cliveden, left Conway's right flank exposed. To the north, an American column, led by McDougall, came under attack by the Loyalist troops of Queen's Rangers and the Guards of the British Reserve. After a brutal contest, McDougall's brigade was forced to retreat, having suffered heavy losses. Despite the reversal in fortune, the Continentals were still convinced of a possible victory. The 9th Virginia Regiment of Greene's column launched a determined attack on the British lines as planned, managing to break through and capturing a number of prisoners. However, they were soon surrounded by 2 arriving British brigades under Cornwallis. Cornwallis then launched a countercharge, cutting off the Virginians completely, forcing them to surrender. Greene, upon learning of his main army's defeat and withdrawal, realized he stood alone against Howe's entire army, and so withdrew. The primary attacks on the British and Hessian camp had all been repulsed with heavy casualties. Washington ordered Armstrong and Smallwood's men to withdraw. Maxwell's brigade, still having failed to capture Cliveden, was forced to fall back. Howe ordered a pursuit, harrying the retreating Americans for some 9 miles, though he did not follow up on his victory. The pursuing British forces were finally forced to retire in the face of resistance from Greene's infantry, Wayne's artillery, and a detachment of dragoons, as well as the coming of night. On October 6th, there was a brief ceasefire. A little terrier that was identified from the collar as belonging to Gen Howe was formally transferred from Washington's camp to Howe's under a flag of truce. The little terrier had been found wandering on the battlefield, was brought to Washington, who had the dog fed, cleaned, and brushed before returning him to Howe. Of the 11,000 men Washington led into battle, 30 officers and 122 men were killed, and 117 officers and 404 men were wounded. According to a Hessian staff officer, some 438 had been taken prisoner by the British, including Colonel George Matthews and the entire 9th Virginia Regiment. Brigadier General Francis Nash, whose North Carolina brigade covered the Americans' retreat, had his left leg taken off by a cannonball and died on October 8th at the home of Adam Goatwalls. His body was interred with military honors on October 9th at the Mennonite Meeting House in Townsend. Major John White, who was shot at Cliveden, died on October 10th. Lieutenant Colonel William Smith, who was wounded carrying the flag of truce to Cliveden, also died from his wounds. In total, 57 Americans, over one-third of those killed in the battle, died in the attack on Cliveden. British casualties in the battle were 71 killed, 448 wounded, and 14 missing, only 24 of whom were Hessians. British officers killed in action included Brigadier General John Agnew and Lieutenant Colonel John Byrd. Lieutenant Colonel William Walcott of the 5th Regiment of Foot was mortally wounded and later died. Workhouse served as a hospital during the battle. The battle was a victory for the British, but the long-term strategic consequences favored the American. Howe had, once again, failed to follow up on his successes and allowed Washington to escape with his army. After the British capture of Philadelphia on September 26, 1777, and the failure of the Americans' surprise attack against the British camp at the Battle of Germantown on October 4th, the Americans tried to deny the British use of the city by blockading the Delaware River. To that end, 2 forts were constructed commanding the river. One was Fort Mercer on the New Jersey side of the Red Bank Plantation in what was then part of Deptford Township, now National Park, New Jersey. The other was Fort Mifflin on Mud Island in the Delaware River just south of the confluence of the river on the Pennsylvania side opposite Fort Mercer. So long as the Americans held both forts, British naval ships could not reach Philadelphia to resupply the army. In addition to the forts, the American possessed a small flotilla of Continental Navy ships on the Delaware, supplemented by the Pennsylvania State Navy. The flotilla consisted of sloops, schooners, galleys, an assortment of floating batteries, and 14 old vessels laden with barrels of tar to be used as a means of defending the river. The fleet was armed with about 100 cannon total, under the overall command of Commodore John Hazelwood. The fleet of Admiral Howe's consisting of 8 or 9 war vessels and several transports. His vessels were fully manned with 285 guns of the war vessels alone. On just 2 of the vessels stranded in the river, Howe commanded more officers and men than Commodore Hazelwood had in his entire fleet. On October 18th, General Sir William Howe, the commander of the British Army, evacuated his camp at Germantown and pulled his forces inside the city of Philadelphia. He sent a part of his force to capture the 2 American forts, denying him use of the Delaware River. Earlier, Howe had sent a group of men via Webb's Ferry at the mouth of the river to marshy Providence Island, actually on the Pennsylvania mainland by Mud Island, to construct artillery batteries to bomb Fort Mifflin. The first bombardment of Fort Mifflin came on October 11th. This was merely a desultory attack which convinced the British to expand and improve their batteries. Meanwhile, 2,000 Hessians, mercenary troops under the command of Colonel Carl Vanderloop, landed at Cooper's Ferry in Camden, New Jersey, about 4 miles upriver from Fort Mercer, and made preparations to attack a fort located at the high ground at Red Bank. The fort was garrisoned with 400 men with 14 pieces of cannon and were reported to have not been intimidated. At 4 p.m., Dunlop sent his officer and a drummer with a flag and summons to surrender with the ultimatum. The King of England orders his rebellious subjects to lay down their arms, and warned that if they stand in battle, no quarter whatever would be given, to which Colonel Greene promptly replied, "We ask no quarters, nor will we give any." The garrison at the fort replied that they would defend the fort to the last man. Since it was associated that the fort was lightly garrisoned, Danope decided to attack directly and declared, "We'll change the name from Fort Red Bank to Fort Danope." Danope, whose attack had been repulsed at the Second Battle of Trenton, was eager to revenge what he considered to be a humiliation. He declared to his men either he would take the fort or he would be dead. Danope soon realized the audacious task that was entrusted to him and asked Howe in vain for more artillery. But Howe ordered him to wait for the British fleet to come upriver to assist him, and that if Danope could not capture the fort, the British would, an order that apparently belittled Danope. On October 20th, 1777, 5 British warships under the command of Captain Hammond made their way through the lower Chevaux de Frise and sailed up the river. Among the vessels which HMS Augusta, outfitted with 64 guns and commanded by Captain Francis Reynolds. Van Danope divided his force into 2 groups, totaling 1,200 men, for a 2-pronged attack upon the fort on the morning of October 22nd. Van Danope and Hessian Grenadier Lieutenant Colonel Van Linston were to attack the second part of the fort, while Colonel Friedrich Ludwig von Minnerodus Grenadiers and Lieutenant Colonel Werner von Merbach's infantry were to attack the northern and eastern approaches. With 5 British men of war in the river to support the attack, Van Danope was convinced that the fort would be his by nightfall. After a cannonade by the Hessian artillery, Linston moved against the 9-foot-high southern parapet, and his men were cut down by devastating cannon and musket fire and were forced to retreat. On the north, Minnerodut's grenadiers managed to scale the ramparts of an abandoned section of the fort, but then, when moved on, were confronted by a tangled mass of felled trees which pointed branches, a kind of abatis, protecting the main wall of the fort. With little in the way of proper tools, they were soon spotted trying to claw their way through the barricade and were fired upon by the Americans waiting for them on the other side. The Continental and Pennsylvania navies provided enfilading fire against the Hessians. Suffering heavy casualties, the Hessians began to retreat, falling back to their camp 10 miles away in the village of Hodenfield, which would have taken after landing at nearby Cooper's Ferry. Van Danope was wounded in the thigh during the southern attack and was left on the battlefield by his retreating troops. Mortally wounded, Van Danope died 3 days later in the Whitehall House, a farmhouse just outside the southern woods of the fort, between the fort and Woodbury Creek. To make matters worse for the British and Hessians, the 6 British men of war were engaged by smaller American gunboats. During the engagement, 2 of the ships, the 64-gun ship of the line HMS Augusta and the sloop of war HMS Merlin, ran aground on a shoal trying to avoid underwater obstacles called chaux de vise or stockades, which were rows of large wooden spears weighted down on the bottom of the river by heavy crates filled with rocks designed to pierce the hulls of intruding British warships. Overnight attempts to free the ships were unsuccessful. Fort Mifflin and the Pennsylvania Navy engaged the stranded ships the next morning with cannons and fire rafts, respectively. Augusta caught fire, and within an hour the fire reached a magazine and the ship exploded, with such force that the explosion was heard in Philadelphia. The Augusta was the largest ship lost by the British in both the Revolutionary War and the eventual War of 1812. Accounts vary as to the cause of the fire. In one account, the loss of the Augusta was attributed to accidental ignition by the British. Navy historian James Fernand Coopers claims that the sides of the hull of the Augusta were packed with hay to repel musket and cannon shot, and during the exchange the hay caught fire and the fire rapidly spread. Crew members gave their testimony, but none could be determined. None remembered having seen or heard the explosion of any powder on the decks. Only Midshipman Reed ventured to suppose that the fire originated from the cannon wads. Admiral Lord Howe seemed to accept his explanation. Soon after, the crew of the Merlin was ordered to abandon the ship and destroy it also. The Hessian army reported casualties of 377 killed and wounded, with 20 missing or captured, while the Americans reported their losses at 14 killed and 27 wounded. Frustrated by the failure to capture Fort Mercer, Howe ordered the Hessian regiments withdrawn from New Jersey while he made plans to attack Fort Mifflin by a massive artillery bombardment. By early November, the British artillery batteries on Providence Island were completed, and a number of warships were available in support. On November 10, 1777, the British opened a full-scale bombardment of Fort Mifflin, which lasted for 5 days. 6 British warships with 2 small floating batteries, HMS Vigilant and HMS Fury, also joined the bombardment to rake Fort Mifflin at close range. After 5 days, on November 15th, the commanding officer of Fort Mifflin, Thomas Simon Thayer, with 250 reported casualties among his 400 men, and with ammunition running low, abandoned the fort that evening, leaving the American flag flying, and evacuated his men to Fort Mercer. The next morning, a small party of British troops landed, unopposed, at deserted Fort Mifflin, hauled down the American flag, and ran up the British Union Jack atop the ruined fort. The bombardment of Fort Mifflin cost the British only a reported 13 sailors and troops killed, with 24 wounded, with some of the damage done to some of their warships and landing batteries. Howe then sent Lord Cornwallis with 2,000 men to attack Fort Mercer, landing them by ferry at Blenningsport, 3 miles to the south. Rather than let the garrison be captured in an overwhelmingly British assault, Colonel Christopher Green decided to abandon the fort on November 20th, leaving the British to occupy it the following day. George Washington's scheme of starving the British out of Philadelphia had failed with the loss of the 2 forts. His only hope now was to lure the British out of Philadelphia into another major land battle at his camp nearby White Marsh. Although Hill did sortie from the city to launch a feint at the American camp in early December, he felt the American position was too strong and retired to Philadelphia for the rest of the winter. Washington and his army encamped at Valley Forge in December 1777, about 20 miles from Philadelphia, where they stayed for the next 6 months. Meanwhile, there was a shake-up in the British command. General Howe resigned his command and was replaced by Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton as Commander-in-Chief. The victory in the north against Burgoyne, along with the valiant fights against Howe by Washington, would convince the French to give larger support to the Americans in the war effort, including troops and ships. These campaigns and the entrance of France into the war would largely end the war in the northern colonies, with the British shifting their efforts to the southern campaigns in late 1778 and 1779 and going forward. And here we have it. We're at the end of these 2 major campaigns. They equal each other out. The British take Philadelphia, but the Americans capture Burgoyne's army, and they show to the French and other possible international allies that they can stand toe-to-toe with the British army, where the fights in the battles of Trenton and Princeton, they showed that the army could be held together. These showed that it could take a beating, it could hand one out in the capture of Burgoyne, and you had some miscues with Washington allowing himself to be surrounded or be outflanked at Brandywine, but that was a lack of proper reconnaissance, which is a common mistake in battles. But then you have these heavy casualties against the Hessians at Fort Mercer, which caused them to be pulled off the line, and they were less used going forward. And it shows the French that the Americans might be able to win this. And it gets the French really into the war. When Howe eventually has to come out of, Clinton has to come out of Philadelphia, because Clinton is in charge at this point, and he retreats back to New York. What he finds in New York is the French Navy. Now that the French are in the war, they're supplying Navy vessels, they're supplying troops that will eventually see combat. You have Marquis de Lafayette, who was already fighting for the Americans as an exchange. He was given a commission in the American Continental Army, and he fought with them. Major figure in these battles, major commander, great at rallying troops, great at strategic plans, but he's a French commander that was given a command in the Continental Army, kind of like an exchange program. Next episode, we're going to take a little break from the battles, and we're going to go into some of the politics. We're going to take a look at the French, how the French got into the war, the steps they got into the war, and any other international allies, how the Americans got some support from international allies, both at first as non-military and then eventually military support, which allows them to stand a little more toe-to-toe, bolster their forces, because it's still hard to recruit. Washington's army after Valley Forge will come out a lot less, but he will be trained. His army will be better trained after Valley Forge. We will get into Valley Forge probably at the start of next episode, because it's very short, 6 months, just a little how it happened. And then you have this combined force of Americans and French going around and fighting the British. And in the end, it's combined force of Americans and French that wins the day at the end of the war. But next episode, we're going to talk about the diplomatic side of the war with Benjamin Franklin in France, with John Adams at one point, how we get from France saying, yeah, you can use our ports, to here's some troops, here's some ships, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this, let's fight together, we'll win this together. But until then, that's the end of for today, for this episode. Thank you for joining us. As always, I love when you join us. If you have any tips, recommendations, any topics that you'd like to hear after we get done with the American Revolution, which we're really close to, let me know on Facebook. Head over to our Facebook page, just search the History Desk. Send me a message. I'll get the information on those topics, and we'll get them into the rotation, and we'll get them out there. I love history. It doesn't matter what the topic is. Find me a topic. I'll research it for you, and we'll do an episode on it. It may not be immediately, but we'll get there. But until then, thanks for listening. Always join us. Never forget to read. Never forget to learn. Take your time. Learn your histories. Watch your histories. Go to a park. We got to keep it alive. You got to keep it alive. Because so many lessons you can learn from history. Small ones, big ones, immediate ones. Mistakes. There's lessons we can learn. Good things, bad things. We all know that. Keep it alive. Till then, read your books. Learn something. Share it with your friends. Little tidbits. Share the history. I'll see you next time. Goodbye, everybody.